If Vermeer or whatever used a camera obscura, go in and get your projector. See if you can do a Vermeer. You can't. You won't. No way, you know. My name is Adam Straus. I come from Miami originally. I'm a father, husband, painter, fisherman. I love adventures in nature, kayaking, but really the art has been the center of my life for 30 years, or at least, no, more like 40 years. My mother was doing sculpture when we were children. And I wasn't the least bit interested in art. I was much more interested in marine biology, and going out in my little boat and diving, snorkeling, collecting tropical fish, collecting snakes and wildlife, seeing wildlife. And I went to University of Florida to basically study marine biology. And at about that time, I got into nature photography and got more and more interested in photography to the point where I started doing black and white, and that led to more artistic, creative image making. And I ended up just getting into art instead of science. Yvonne Streetman at University of Florida, I wasn't allowed into the photo courses, which is very common in universities. If you're not an art major, if you're a science major, you're not allowed into the art classes, which is really kind of sad because some of the best artists I know have come from other areas. But anyway, I wasn't allowed into the photo classes and I wanted to take them. So I took Yvonne Streetman photographs that I had been doing secretly in their darkroom. I'd been sneaking into their darkroom and using the facility to do my own work. And I took her this portfolio and she looked at it and really flipped over it and wrote me a note basically that got me into the photo classes. So that was really kind of the beginning of being able to really learn about art. My mother, as I've said before, was doing sculpture. So she was very supportive. My father was supportive, but not visual. It's interesting. My mother's side of the family was much more visual than my father's side, but he was still supportive. He wanted me to be able to, make a living, and he was worried about that in terms of art. But they were very supportive. They bought photo paper for me to work on. They did all kinds of numerous things to support me. And unfortunately, my father died before he got to see me start selling work. And that was just if he had lived another 3 years, he would have begun to see me sell art, and that would have been really wonderful for him, I think. Lately, who have I been mostly inspired by? I love Gerhard Richter. I think Gerhard Richter is probably the most interesting artist, one of the most interesting artists of our time. Anselm Kiefer is another one that I really find unbelievable. I don't really find either one of them in my work so much, probably Richter more than Kiefer right now. I've done a number of things that remind me of Richter. I love what he does with pictures, with the idea of representation and the idea of painterly ideas with representation and realism. Of course, he also does the abstractions and sometimes combines the abstraction with the representational, which is also interesting to me. I just think he's done so much more with the idea of picture making than anybody I can think of in the last 30 or 40 years. People have had that debate about like using photography to paint from as opposed to being out in the landscape and painting. Painters have used the going back centuries to the camera obscura to project an image onto the canvas to work from. My joke is always there's no rules in art. If you're painting something, whether it's real or not, realist or not, to make a really successful painting is hard. It's very hard. So there's no rules. I mean, it's hard to make a painting if you project the image onto it. You still got to make the damn painting, if you've got a camera obscura, you've still got to make the bloomin' painting, believe me. If Vermeer or whatever used a camera obscura, go in and get your projector, see if you can do a Vermeer. You can't, you won't, no way, it's not gonna happen, So it's kind of like, I don't know, there's no rules, and I work from photographs, I work from memory, and I try to just make something that works. A lot of times it's interesting when you're using photographs to work from, you realize very quickly how limited the photograph is and how it doesn't work. I mean, the photograph very often can get away with all kinds of things because it's so realist. It's so immediately realist. But when you start transferring it into drawing or painting, you realize, oh my God, this photograph doesn't work. That doesn't work. I've got to change that to make it work. Lately, I've been doing underpaintings with a very yellow, hot yellow called Indian yellow and reds. I use a lot of underpainting with reds and then go over it because I usually end up with cooler grays and blues. So I'll use underpainting in those colors. Sometimes I don't use underpainting at all. I just start painting. And lately, I've also been drawing under the painting. I've been layering the painting with newspaper and shopping lists and drawings. I've been gluing that to the canvas before I even start drawing and painting on top of it. Again, I mean, my techniques have been, over the years, have been extremely varied. I've just done so many different methods of painting. I'll even use a squeegee now and then, or palette knives, and as well as brushes. Everything. Again, I'm a strong proponent of anything you can come up with, trying it, and seeing if it works. The artist that I studied with always said, the original photographer I studied with, Jerry Uelsman, he used to say, if you can think of it, it's worth trying. Just go for it. And that's the way I've always worked. I read the news every day, and the news went from bad to worse for me. That was my perception of it. I felt like, I felt nervous. So I wanted to escape from that feeling. So I started gluing the newspaper and transferring it onto the canvas as an underlayer, and then painting these landscapes on top of that with some of the news coming through. So it was a method of escaping from that news, but at the same time acknowledging that it was happening and putting the painting within a time period, within its history. I used a spray that's called deacidification spray. It's basically creates a barrier between the acid and whatever's on top of it. So you spray the newspaper before I would glue it and deacidify the paper. And then it's also sealed with glues and acrylic mediums on top. So it's pretty much embedded. It's almost embedded like something in amber, you know. It's should be really protected from the elements. So I would think it would last. I would think it would last pretty well. There's a lot of, I mean, Rauschenberg used newspaper, Jasper Johns used newspaper, a lot of newspaper in their work, in their paintings. Jasper Johns used it underneath the encaustic. Rauschenberg used it in his combines very often. I feel like I've learned how to paint more. You know, every day I learn something, every week. I'm better at rendering than I was 20 years ago, but that at the same time has enabled me a confidence to become looser with it as well. It's almost like I've gotten to the point where I can render, so I'll render something and then try to destroy it or try to obliterate part of it. That's become more interesting to me in the last few years, the idea of rendering and then doing something on top of it or to the image to disrupt it in some way. And that also becomes a metaphor for the image of nature and what's happening to it, you know, because of our presence, our disruptive presence. The figures have always been small. They're very, if they exist in the landscape at all, they're usually very small. That's primarily, or one reason that is because I can't paint the figure. The figure is incredibly difficult to paint. You really have to practice the figure to paint it. And I just haven't been that interested in the figure. I'm much more interested in the natural landscape than the figure. But interestingly enough, Thomas Cole was the same way. The figures in the Hudson River painter Thomas Cole are always very small. And one of the reasons is he could also not paint the figure. It also, you know, works within the idea he has of the glory of nature and man being this tiny participant in this world. You know, this kind of existential idea of man at the whim of nature. And that works for me too. I mean, I like that small figure isolated in nature. I tried to paint a portrait of my son, and I couldn't do it. It just did not work. I've done a couple paintings of, for a while, I've got these home movies from the 50s and early 60s of us growing up, which are kind of interesting. And at one point I took still photographs off of those films and tried to work from them and was able to get a semblance of what they looked like. But I just, I mean, that's what's so impressive about Eric Fischl. He took on the figure and wasn't really trained to do the figure and has been able to really learn how to do the figure. It's incredibly difficult, and you've got to be, you've got to be motivated and interested in the figure. I just haven't been. We went to see a Jeff Koons, the retrospective at the Whitney a few years ago, and my son was walking through it, and he said, "Does he make this? What, you know?" And I said, "Well, actually, he doesn't make most of it. He's got assistants and foundries that make the sculpture. He comes up with the idea, and they make it for him." And my son was going, "Well, that's not fair. That's cheating. That's sort of," and once again, I would say, you know, there's no rules in art. You know, you still got to come up with the idea, and it doesn't bother me a bit. It's not the way I've ever wanted to work. I like making something with my hands. Myself, I don't like people enough to have them working with me in here. I want to be alone. So I do everything myself, basically. I mean, I've had some carpenters make frames for me, but other than that, it's, you know, and stretchers and things like that. Other than that, I stretch my canvas, I prime it, I sand it, I work on it. But I have no qualms about how everybody else works. I mean, again, there's no rules in art. You know, that's a great thing. There's just, you know, other than like you don't want to, you know, hurt anybody. I think if you work from your heart and your mind, it's going to be original. You know, every artist hopefully has influences. You know, I think every artist I would hope that every artist looks at work as much as they can, other artists. I think an artist that doesn't look at other artists is kind of odd. It's kind of like a writer not reading other writers. I don't think, I've never known of a good writer who's not a reader. I don't know of a good artist that's not somebody who looks at art of everybody else. Originality, I think, just comes from doing what's really true to you, getting to the heart of what matters to yourself. So this is my walk. This is my walk every evening, coming back from fishing during the spring. I don't think of it as political. I think of it maybe as more social. Political, you really have to enter into that arena. You know, I mean, in Florida, I ran for office, for U.S. Senate. I ran a bogus campaign for U.S. Senate, and I kind of disrupted an election because I got radio interviews, and it went out like on AP Wire, and I got enough votes to like disrupt an election. That was political. That was a political act. That my art is not really political, but it is aware, hopefully, of what's going on in some ways. In my 20s, I was doing sculpture, large, very dark, dangerous, ominous sculptures with sharpened railroad spikes sticking out from them, with little kind of temple-like dooms, and very, very dark work. And then somewhere at a certain point, I started doing the small paintings, and they were also dark. When I moved to New York in my early 30s, things started lightening up, interestingly enough. I went from Florida, where it was very bright and colorful, to New York, where it was darker, and the paintings lightened up. They started using more color. They lightened up once I got to New York in my early 30s. So I guess I've always worked opposite. The really odd thing about this is the crack was painted here, but when it was hung on the wall, the crack jumped up and went up the wall. This comes from a hike on Mount Washington in the snow in April. Very sublime experience. I wanted the painting to have that quality, but at the same time put a crack in it to suggest that experience is happening to us all less and less because of preoccupation with all kinds of things in life, digitally and every other way. About 1995, I showed with Nohra Haime for about 5 years. She started showing me in 1990. I'd sold some paintings in Florida at a gallery where actually Nohra had first seen my work, Anne Jaffe Gallery, and but nothing nothing substantial. 95, I was able to. I had been driving a truck, an art mover, when I first got to New York for several years, and I think it was 95 or 96 before I could really quit that and just be in the studio full time. I love materials. I love paint. I love what it's painted on. To me, I'm on Instagram, and when I see, looking at things on Instagram is absurd to me. I do it and I enjoy it. I try to keep up with it and stuff, but it's an absurd way to look at art. The screen is really, great paintings will show up on the screen as not being all that good, and the opposite is true too. It's a horrible way. It's like showering with a raincoat, it's awful, a way to look at art, unless I guess you can make art that's specifically for the digital world, like the latest stuff with the Beeple, the non-fungible tokens and stuff. And that's kind of an interesting idea, that the guy would take like 5,000 drawings, a drawing from each day, and put them together into this composite and stuff. But I'm not a big fan of the digital world. I used to load up my station wagon in Tallahassee, Florida, where I'd been at school and I was living, and I had my studio, and I would drive down to Miami with work in the back of the station wagon. And I did that at one point, and I walked into Anne Jaffe Gallery, and I said, "Hi, I'm Adam Straus. I'm an artist I live in Tallahassee. I have some work in the back of my station wagon. Would you like to see it?" And they said, "Sure, we'll look at it." And so I went out to the station wagon and got the work and dragged it in, and Anne Jaffe actually Anne Jaffe wasn't there. The people that worked for her were there, and they really liked it, and they looked at it, and we talked, and we really hit it off and stuff. And they called Anne Jaffe and said, you need to come by the gallery and see this guy, So she came by, and we hit it off, and she started showing me. And that's where Nohra saw my work, and actually, we ran into each other just by chance. I had come down to the gallery in Miami to deliver some work, and Nohra was in the gallery, came into the gallery at the same time. So we met each other, and at that point I said I was thinking about moving to New York, and she thought that was great, and she called me a few weeks later and offered me a show with her. This painting was done at the time of the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Martin Luther King. I remember that evening when we heard the news. My parents had been very active in civil rights. My mother began to weep, and I didn't even know who Martin Luther King was at the time. I think I was 10 or 11 years old. Learned about him later. But this is the last speech he gave before he was assassinated. I've been to the promised land, I've been to the mountaintop, I have seen the promised land. I might not get there with you, but we will get there, etc. So I wanted to do the mountaintop, and then I started scrawling the lines from the speech over the painting and then repainting over it. And so they would come through somewhat, but at the same time become illegible. And as I was scrolling it, it became still looking for the promised land instead of I've been to the promised land, I've seen the promised land. So that's the story of that painting. Art is a very broad subject to me. Joseph Beuys, one of my favorite artists, a German artist, used to say that everything creative can be art, that the act of peeling a potato can be art. I always liked that idea, that everybody was an artist, that creativity was art. poetry, music. I think everything that moves you in a certain way to contemplate your existence, the people you know, the people you love, the landscape, the world in a slightly different way is art. One of the things that has struck me as the younger generation, the static image, the painting, the static photograph, the static image, I think seems to them to be just incredibly boring because they're used to so much sensation. So I don't know. I hope that's not true. I hope the static image doesn't leave our culture. Because I think there's something about the static image that's completely magical too, in addition to the stimulation and sensational imagery. But my son is not, I mean, his generation does not look at paintings the same way we do. It just doesn't happen, I don't think.
What changed?
Well, I think the stimulation, I think the amount of stimulation is so much different, that they can't see. I mean, my son likes what I paint, and he really actually likes looking at art sometimes, even though we've dragged him for years to the art fairs and stuff, and he complains. He does like it in little portions, but he says it himself. It's just, you know, it's so much more boring to them than a video game, than a video sensation. Or
how old is your son?
18. I mean, I like the idea of these paintings existing after I go. I love the idea of somebody getting something from them, you know, looking at them every day or every week, or, you know, and having it just be a part of their life. I mean, it's like I've said to my son, this is like, the painting is different. Painting is like a song you can listen to over and over and over again. You know, like there's nothing. I mean, even great books, you might reread them once or even twice. But a painting, a really wonderful painting, you can look at over and over again. You know, it's unique in that respect. I mean, even a song you will listen to a certain number of times and that'll be it. You know, it's remarkable in that respect.